Zila stood at the entrance of the gleaming, futuristic mansion, her heart pounding with anticipation. Her mother, an alien of striking beauty and regal poise, and her father, a towering figure with sharp features, awaited inside. Zila had spent weeks preparing for this moment, introducing her human lover, Dave, to her high-ranking family. She had always known there would be a clash of cultures, but nothing could prepare her for how it would play out. "Are you sure about this, Zila?" her mother had asked earlier, the suspicion in her voice unmistakable. "He's human." "I'm sure, mother," Zila replied, her smile a little too wide. "He's the one." She could feel Dave's nervous energy beside her. He wasn't used to the extravagance of alien aristocracy. His clothes were far too plain for the opulent atmosphere of Zila's family home. His rugged, Earthling charm was completely at odds with the alien customs she had grown up with. But Zila was determined. She loved Dave, and surely they would accept him. The door opened, and the two aliens in charge of her family's estate greeted them. Zila's parents were statuesque, regal, the epitome of what an advanced species could become: elegant, disciplined, cultured. Dave, on the other hand, stood in contrast, casually dressed in a worn t-shirt and jeans, his hair a mess, his demeanor too relaxed for the occasion. "Ah, so this is the infamous savage you've been raving about," Zila's mother said with an exaggerated smile. "Tell me, Dave, do you even understand the meaning of etiquette?" Dave, clearly unfazed, shrugged. "I don't know, I guess. We just do our own thing back on Earth." He looked around the room and said, "Wow, this place is fancy." Zila's father tilted his head. "Fancy? What an interesting word. I assume your kind doesn't have words for elegance and refinement?" Dave grinned. "Not really, but we know how to get things done." He scratched his head, clearly unsure of how to handle the formalities, but that was Dave. A man of few words, no pretensions. The meal began, and Zila's parents wasted no time in testing Dave's ability to conform to alien expectations. Zila's mother handed him a strange utensil that resembled a fork but was far more complicated. "Use this properly," she said, watching him with a keen eye. Dave took the utensil and examined it for a moment before sticking it directly into his mouth, chewing thoughtfully. Her mother recoiled. "That's not how you use it," she said, her voice laced with disgust. "That's a ceremonial utensil. It's to symbolize the refinement of your civilization. You don't eat from it like an animal." Dave paused, looking at her mother with confusion. "I mean, it works fine. You just poke your food with it and then eat it, right?" He went back to eating, completely unaware of the social blunder he'd just committed. The room went silent for a moment before her father chuckled. "Zila, it's quite clear that your savage has no concept of grace." He shook his head, looking back at Dave. "And I assume you have no idea how to communicate with such a high-ranking family?" "I mean," Dave said casually, "I don't really do the whole formal speech thing. I just tell it like it is." He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked at Zila's parents. "So, you're all aliens, right? Do you guys have, like, a formal title for being the big shots? Or is that just a given?" Zila's mother shot a venomous glare at him. "You dare address us so casually?" Dave shrugged. "Well, I'm just saying, I know the whole supreme power thing is a big deal here, but back home, we like to keep it simple. We call ourselves regular folks." Zila tried to stifle her laugh. This was exactly what she had feared, yet there was something undeniably charming about Dave's irreverence. Her parents, however, were not so amused. Her father tried again, pushing his glass of exotic liquid toward Dave. "Drink this, and you will show respect for our culture," he instructed. "It's a symbol of unity among the stars." Dave looked at the glass. Okay. Looks like something you'd get in a weird nightclub back home." He took the glass and chugged it down without hesitation. The entire family went rigid in horror. "Do you realize what you just drank?" Zila's mother asked, her voice trembling. "That was a centuries-old drink, meant only for diplomatic occasions." Dave gave an innocent grin. "You said it was a symbol of unity, right? Figured I'd help the cause." Plus, I was thirsty. Zila's parents exchanged incredulous glances, but before they could scold him further, Dave wiped his mouth and said, I gotta admit, not bad. Kind of like a mix of something strong and a fruit punch. But hey, no complaints here. This place knows how to throw a party. The tension in the room mounted as her mother clenched her fists, clearly struggling to maintain her composure. This is embarrassing, Zila. A savage like this cannot represent us. He is unrefined, primitive. The galaxy's elite will never accept such behavior. Zila, desperate to smooth things over, stepped in. Mom, Dad, let's just... Before she could finish, Dave interrupted her. Hey, you guys have any of those giant, sharp-toothed creatures you hunt for sport? That's always a cool way to break the ice back home. I'm down for anything that'll get this awkwardness out of the way. Zila's parents stared at him, horrified, as the silence stretched for a moment longer. Then, with an unexpected twist, her father let out a loud, booming laugh. You actually want to hunt our local beasts? Why not? If they're like the stuff back home, I'd be up for it. It'd be like a little adventure. Zila's mother finally cracked a smile, although it was full of disbelief. Unbelievable. Your human ways are so crude. But somehow you make it entertaining. Dave, oblivious to the underlying tension, grinned. Guess that's just the Earth charm. Zila watched in disbelief as her parents, once disgusted by Dave's savage ways, started to show faint traces of amusement. The evening was far from perfect, but there was an unexpected sense of satisfaction in Zila's heart. Maybe, just maybe, Dave's savage charm could win over even the most elite of alien families. And as the night went on, Zila couldn't help but wonder if her parents might just be starting to appreciate her savage Earthling after all. The dinner table fell into an uncomfortable silence after Dave's enthusiastic attempt to bond with the alien family by discussing Earth's savage customs. Zila's mother, still stiff with indignation, slowly placed her hands on the table, her fingers twitching as if she might throw something at him. Zila, meanwhile, tried to hold back a laugh, though her face flushed with the awkwardness of the situation. So, Dave, Zila's father began, trying to regain control of the conversation. I understand Earthlings like to keep things simple, but you must appreciate the finer things in life, no? Dave scratched his head, looking genuinely confused. Finer things? Well, I guess we don't exactly have a fancy definition for it. But if it means just enjoying life, I'd say we've got that down. Zila's father grunted. So no appreciation for the finer intricacies of civilization? Dave shrugged. Nah, I don't really do the whole finer intricacies thing. I just prefer people who are real. And, food that doesn't make you question whether it's alive or not. He speared another piece of food from his plate, not noticing the disgusted looks exchanged by Zila's family. Real, Zila's mother repeated under her breath, barely hiding the sarcasm. And what exactly does that mean, Dave? Dave set his fork down and looked at her. It means not pretending to be something we're not. On Earth, you get straight talk, none of this. He waved his hands around, gesturing at the opulent surroundings. Extra fluff. The words hung in the air for a second, and Zila's parents exchanged uncomfortable glances. The gravity of their status, their unspoken superiority, suddenly felt ridiculous. Zila couldn't help but notice that her mother's face was twitching, as though she were trying to decide whether to throw Dave out the window or laugh. Let's move on to a different subject, Zila's father said, tapping the table with his finger. I'm sure you've heard of the Galactic Peace Accords. Dave nodded slowly. Yeah, we've heard of it, but let's be real. You guys talk all about peace, but there's always someone stirring up trouble. It's kind of like those people who say they're all about love but then act like jerks in private. Zila's mother nearly choked on her drink. You speak so bluntly. Do you not understand the importance of diplomacy, of subtlety? Sure, I get it, Dave said, completely unfazed. But I'd rather have someone be straightforward with me than play games. Subtlety's great and all, but it doesn't help when you're being stabbed in the back. He casually reached for a bread roll, not realizing the firestorm he was igniting with each word. Zila's parents were visibly perturbed now. They had spent centuries cultivating a society based on diplomacy, nuance, and a delicate balance of power. And here was this man, this Earthling, who spoke in blunt, honest terms that felt as jarring as a sledgehammer to their finely tuned sensibilities. But despite the discomfort, something in the air was shifting. Zila's father spoke up again, though his tone had softened just a touch. "Tell me, Dave, what would your people do if an external threat were to suddenly challenge your way of life?" Dave's eyes gleamed. "Well, I can tell you one thing, Earth's not afraid of a challenge. If we're backed into a corner, we fight. And we fight dirty if we have to. We don't worry about being polite while we're getting the job done." He paused and then added, "We're not afraid to get our hands dirty." A chilling silence fell over the room. Zila's parents exchanged glances, their once calm expressions now tinged with uncertainty. This was not the answer they had expected. For the first time in the conversation, Dave's words seemed to cut through the polite barriers they had set up. He wasn't talking about elegant solutions or diplomatic finesse. He was talking about survival. "You think your people would defeat us?" Zila's mother asked, her voice tight. "You, with your primitive methods?" "Well, I'm not sure I'd call primal instincts primitive," Dave said with a smile. "When you don't have all the fancy tech and protocols, you find other ways to get things done. Some of us call it resourcefulness." Zila's father leaned forward. "Resourcefulness? Or sheer recklessness?" He stared at Dave, waiting for a response. Dave smirked. "Recklessness, sure, if you want to call it that. But at least we get results. We don't just sit around discussing problems and hoping someone else will fix them." Zila's mother, clearly irritated, raised her hand as if to stop the conversation, but her father waved her off. The challenge in Dave's words seemed to have struck a chord with him. "I must admit," he said slowly, "there's something about your approach that is unorthodox." Dave leaned back in his chair. "Unorthodox, huh? Yeah, that's kind of our thing. We do things differently on Earth. I'm not saying we're perfect, but when it counts, we get the job done." Zila's mother shot her husband an exasperated look. "This is madness, dear. We can't be seen as lowering our standards to this level. His ways are so crass." Zila, watching the exchange unfold, felt a wave of defiance rising within her. She had always known that Dave was different, but it was becoming clear that his differences weren't weaknesses. They were strengths, especially when compared to the polished yet ineffective systems of her people. Before the tension could escalate further, an unexpected sound broke the silence. A loud crash from the hallway. Zila, you might want to check on that," Dave said casually, pointing toward the door. Zila, relieved for a distraction, quickly excused herself to investigate. As she walked toward the noise, she heard Dave continue speaking to her parents, his voice calm and confident. "Don't worry, I'll fix it. I'm great with my hands." Zila paused at the door, a mixture of amusement and frustration in her chest. She knew that Dave was oblivious to the cultural storm he had just stirred, but part of her admired his ability to speak his truths so boldly, even if it sent her parents into a tailspin. When she returned to the dining room, she was greeted with the sight of her parents looking visibly more relaxed than they had been before. Zila's father, of all people, was nodding thoughtfully as Dave explained how he had taken care of the broken device in the hallway. "Well, it's true," Zila's father said slowly. "There's something about your method that works." He paused, then added, "Maybe it's not always about diplomacy. Sometimes, the direct approach is the only one that cuts through the noise." Dave grinned. "I told you. I'm just a savage man getting things done." Zila couldn't help but smile, relieved that her Earthling, Savage, was, somehow, winning them over, not with refinement, but with pure, unadulterated human resourcefulness. It wasn't much, but in that moment Dave had done what no one else could. He had proven that there was more to Earth than their alien perceptions of primitive. Zila's parents were no longer glaring at Dave, though they still maintained a careful distance. It was as if his bluntness had started to chip away at the walls of formality they had so carefully constructed, and with every passing moment, they seemed less offended by his savage, Earthling ways. But Zila knew better than to think they were entirely convinced. They were still processing everything he'd said, and more importantly, what he'd done. Her father, in particular, was deep in thought, staring at Dave as though trying to decipher the mystery of Earth's simplest beings. After a long silence, her father finally spoke. "You're not like other species we've encountered." His tone had softened from judgment to something almost resembling curiosity. "You see the world differently, don't you?" Dave chuckled, clearly pleased by the question. "Well, yeah. We don't complicate things too much. If it works, it works. We're good at fixing problems, even when no one else knows what the hell's going on." Zila's mother scowled, but her husband held up a hand, signaling for her to remain silent. "Fixing problems, in your own way, I suppose?" He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Dave. "But you must realize that your solutions are not the only way. We've been solving problems for millennia. Our ways are refined." "Refined doesn't always mean effective," Dave shot back. "Take that thing you tried to fix earlier, the device in the hallway. You guys spent an hour trying to figure it out with all these fancy tools, and I just unplugged it and plugged it back in. Simple stuff." He gave a shrug, completely unaware of the tension still lingering in the air. "Sometimes, the old-fashioned way is the best." Her mother gasped, as if Dave had insulted the entire alien race. "Old-fashioned?" she said, her voice full of disdain. "You call it old-fashioned when you bypass centuries of development? You think you know better than generations of scholars and engineers?" "Honestly? Yeah," Dave replied, unabashed. "I mean, if I'm doing the same job with less effort, I'm good with it." Zila's father took a long, thoughtful pause. "There's something to that," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Perhaps we've been too caught up in our own methods." Zila couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her parents, who had spent their lives cultivating sophistication, who had thought of themselves as the peak of galactic society, were actually considering Dave's primitive methods as worth exploring. She watched, wide-eyed, as her father continued. "You're saying Earthlings don't need all the tools and the rituals we've perfected? That you can get by with what seems like rudimentary techniques?" "Exactly," Dave said. "I'm not saying Earth's perfect. We've got our issues for sure. But when it comes to handling things on the fly, we're pretty damn good. We don't wait around for the stars to align." Zila's mother, still clearly uneasy with the whole idea, crossed her arms. "So what you're suggesting is that we throw away centuries of progress and follow your savage way of thinking?" Her voice dripped with sarcasm. "That would be a true advancement." Zila braced herself, knowing that this was the moment. This was the tipping point. If Dave didn't tread carefully now, her parents would go right back to rejecting him. But, of course, Dave never knew when to be careful. He leaned forward, giving her mother a serious look. "No, I'm not saying you throw everything away," he said, his voice firm. "I'm saying that maybe, just maybe, it's time for a little real-world perspective. Sometimes we get so focused on how things should be done that we forget about the simplest, most effective way of getting things done. That's what I'm offering. A fresh perspective." Zila's mother shook her head, unable to accept what she was hearing. "You think your perspective will solve everything? You think being savage makes you more advanced than us? We've achieved what you could never even dream of." Dave, never one to back down, shot back. "I don't need to dream about it. You guys have all this technology and sophistication, and yet you can't even deal with a malfunctioning device without breaking into a sweat. Back on Earth, we'd have that thing up and running in no time." There was a long pause. Zila's father looked at his wife, then back at Dave, and slowly nodded. "Perhaps there's truth to what you're saying. Perhaps we have become too obsessed with complexity and forgotten about the importance of simplicity." He looked directly at Dave, as if weighing the man before him. "You have a point. A different way of looking at things." Dave's grin spread wider. "I've been telling you. Sometimes the simplest approach is the best. It's not about brute force or technology, it's about using what you have to get results. Zila felt a flicker of triumph. This was the breakthrough they needed. Despite the tension and the awkwardness of the evening, Dave had managed to sway her parents. They were no longer just dismissing him as a simple earthling with primitive ways. They were beginning to see him as someone whose approach to problems might actually be valuable. As the conversation drifted into more theoretical territory, with her parents cautiously asking more questions about Earth's methods, Zila found herself drifting into thought. She was stunned by how quickly her parents had gone from complete rejection to reluctant acceptance. It was clear that Dave had disrupted their carefully constructed worldview, and now they were slowly coming to terms with the idea that his savage qualities might actually have their own merits. Zila, her father said finally, his voice softer than before. Perhaps you were right after all. This savage earthling has shown us something we did not expect. Zila's heart swelled with pride. She looked over at Dave, who had just finished stuffing his face with yet another bread roll, completely unaware of the magnitude of the shift that had just occurred. Maybe Earthlings do have something to teach us, her father continued. Something we've overlooked in our pursuit of refinement. Zila smiled, a little proud, a little amused. She knew her parents still had a long way to go before they would fully embrace Dave's savage ways, but for the first time, they had started to understand. Maybe Earth wasn't so primitive after all. Her mother, still unconvinced but too polite to argue further, smiled tightly and nodded. We'll see. As the night carried on, Zila watched her parents continue to engage with Dave, this time with less condescension and more genuine curiosity. The cracks in their judgment were starting to widen, and in that moment, she realized that Dave, with all his simplicity and lack of pretense, might just be the key to shaking her family from its rigid, self-imposed constraints. And for the first time that evening, Zila truly felt proud of her choice. Dave was exactly what her family needed, someone who could disrupt their pretensions, challenge their assumptions, and show them that there was more to wisdom than sophistication. Maybe Earth's savage qualities were exactly what the universe had been waiting for. The following morning, the atmosphere at Zila's family estate was markedly different. Where once there was tension, there was now a tentative acceptance, even curiosity. Her parents, who had spent the entire evening throwing passive-aggressive jabs at Dave, were now strangely quiet, as if processing the overnight revelations. Dave, in his usual oblivious manner, had no clue that he just transformed the dynamic in the room. He was happily digging into another plate of alien food, making his usual blunt remarks that somehow kept landing in the right places. Zila, on the other hand, was fully aware of the shift. She had never seen her parents so contemplative before. Her mother, who had nearly thrown him out just hours ago, now regarded him with a mixture of skepticism and respect. Zila's father, the stoic leader of their family, was the most surprising. His once icy demeanor had thawed, though his pride was still bruised. It was as if Dave had unwittingly slipped past their cultural defenses, making them realize that maybe, just maybe, their carefully constructed superiority wasn't as infallible as they'd thought. So, Dave, Zila's father started, his voice a little softer than usual. You say your people are capable of surviving, without all the luxuries we take for granted. He leaned forward, his gaze sharp but no longer hostile. What is it that you think makes your Earthlings so resilient? Dave looked up from his plate, wiping his mouth casually. We've got a lot of problems, sure. But when things go wrong, we find a way to fix it. We don't sit around and wait for someone else to do the work. If we have to get our hands dirty, we do it. He paused, looking directly at Zila's father. And we're not afraid to fail. We take risks, even if they don't work out. Zila's father processed the response in silence for a moment. Interesting. On our planet, we tend to avoid failure at all costs. We pride ourselves on precision, on planning. We believe that success comes from avoiding mistakes. Dave smirked. Well, sure, that's nice. But the thing is, if you never fail, you never learn. You just stay stuck, playing it safe. He looked around at the family, who were all watching him now, waiting for him to continue. Humans? We keep going, even when we fall flat on our faces. We know how to get back up. Zila's mother raised an eyebrow, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. That's a very Earthling perspective. Do you honestly believe that your approach is superior to ours? Not superior, Dave said with a shrug. Just different. You guys have this whole thing about control and precision, but sometimes, all that structure keeps you from seeing the bigger picture. You get so focused on doing things the right way that you forget to ask if it's even the right thing to do. There it was again, the raw honesty, the simplicity that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Zila's parents sat in stunned silence, their once dismissive attitude toward Dave now replaced with something else, a dawning understanding. Her father, who had long prided himself on his intellect and strategic thinking, was no longer glaring at Dave in disdain. Instead, he was contemplating his words, processing the value in them. Zila could see it now. Her parents were finally recognizing the truth Dave had been unknowingly revealing. His savage methods, the very ones they had ridiculed, were, in fact, what they lacked. They had spent so long refining their civilization that they had lost touch with the raw, untapped potential of their own instincts. Dave's earthy perspective had jarred them awake, and it was undeniable now. Humanity's approach to life had merit, even if it was rough around the edges. Her mother, still trying to retain some level of superiority, let out a huff. It's all well and good, Dave, but we don't have the luxury of constantly learning by failure. We are a society built on success. Yeah, I get that, Dave replied nonchalantly. But if you don't take risks, you're never going to grow. I'm not saying you should throw everything out the window, but sometimes you need a fresh perspective. It's easy to get stuck in your ways when things are comfortable. Zila's father chuckled softly, something that might have passed as a smile if it weren't for the pride still lingering in his eyes. I must admit you do have a point. Perhaps we've been too comfortable. Too controlled. Maybe it's time we considered other ways of thinking. Zila felt a warm sense of accomplishment. Not just because her family was finally coming around, but because they were starting to see the value in Dave's approach to life. It wasn't just a matter of cultural shock anymore. It was about recognizing that Earthlings, in all their so-called savagery, had a certain rawness that could be a catalyst for change. And besides, Dave added with a grin, we have a lot of fun while we're doing it. That earned a small laugh from Zila's father. Fun, you say? Yeah, well, on Earth, we like to enjoy the ride even when things get rough. You've got to find joy in the chaos. Zila's mother finally broke into a smile, though it was small and reluctant. I never thought I'd hear myself say this, but I think I understand what you're trying to say. She leaned back in her chair, her arms still crossed but with a far less hostile energy. Maybe we have become too rigid. Perhaps a bit of chaos could be what we need. The conversation drifted into quieter discussions about Earth's history, and Dave continued to explain his perspective on life, his values, and how humanity thrived despite constant adversity. Zila, listening intently, couldn't help but feel a sense of pride swelling within her. Dave wasn't just winning over her parents, he was helping them see that they, too, could evolve. They didn't have to abandon their principles, but maybe they could take a page from humanity's book and embrace the unpredictability of life. As the conversation wound down, her parents exchanged a few quiet words. Zila didn't need to hear them to know what was happening. There was a shift. Her family, the epitome of alien sophistication and high society, had been humbled by Dave's unrefined yet undeniably effective approach to life. It wasn't just about his savage nature anymore, it was about the values beneath it. Zila's father cleared his throat. Dave, he said, his voice carrying an unexpected weight. Perhaps it's time we considered adding a bit of savage thinking to our own methods. What do you say? Dave smiled, completely unaware of how monumental the moment was. I'm just here to help. And just like that, Zila knew, her savage Earthling had earned his place among her family. Not through grandeur or sophistication, but through pure, unfiltered humanity. She had no idea what the future would hold, but for the first time, she felt like her worlds had collided in the best possible way. It was raw, it was real, and it was beautiful.